At 3:17 a.m., the phone in Killian Blackwood's penthouse shattered 5 years of silence. On the other end of the line was Sloane Mercer, the secretary who had never called outside of business hours, never asked for a favor, and never, in half a decade of service, given him a single reason to question her composure. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was small. "I'm in jail. I didn't know who else to call." Sloane Mercer had built her entire career on being invisible. She was the silent machinery behind the Blackwood empire, the one who knew the contents of every locked drawer, the schedule of every private meeting, and the names that were never spoken aloud in polite company. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in a pencil skirt, efficient, anticipatory, and utterly beyond reproach. She had fetched his coffee at 6 a.m. and fielded calls from men whose names made senators nervous, and she had done it all without so much as a hair out of place. Now she sat on a metal bench in Precinct Holding, her $400 silk blouse torn at the shoulder, her mascara a dark smear beneath eyes that hadn't stopped burning since the arresting officer read her rights. Her fingers, usually steady enough to take dictation in a room full of killers, trembled around the receiver of a payphone that smelled of rust and old grief. She had one call. She made it to the only man in the world more dangerous than the situation she was in. Killian Blackwood didn't ask questions. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Don't speak to anyone," in a tone that implied the consequences for disobedience would be visited upon the entire precinct, and the line went dead. Sloane set the phone back in its cradle. For the first time in 5 years, she had absolutely no idea what came next. "Thank you for sticking around with me, and welcome back, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now back to the story. The precinct had seen its share of dangerous men. Drug lords with dead eyes. Hit men with tattoos crawling up their necks like vines. Politicians whose smiles could cut glass. But when the front doors swung open at 3:52 a.m., and Killian Blackwood walked through them, every officer in the building felt the temperature drop. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Killian moved like a man who had never been told no in his life, and if he had, the person who'd said it was no longer around to repeat the mistake. His suit was immaculate, a 3-piece charcoal ensemble that probably cost more than most of the officers made in a month. His dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on magazine covers or wanted posters, depending on who you asked. But it was his eyes that made people forget how to breathe. Pale gray, winter cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. He stopped at the front desk. The sergeant on duty, a 20-year veteran named Kowalski who had once talked down a gunman during a hostage situation, found himself straightening in his chair like a schoolboy caught passing notes. "Sloane Mercer," Killian said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. "I'm here to collect her." It wasn't a request. Kowalski's fingers fumbled on the keyboard. "Sir, visiting hours aren't until." Killian's gaze didn't waver. He simply waited. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the back, a phone rang, and no one answered it. 2 officers who had been walking toward the coffee machine suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker nervously. I'll get the paperwork," Kowalski said. 23 minutes later, Sloane emerged from the holding area. She looked worse than she had on the phone. Her silk blouse, the cream one she saved for important client meetings, hung limply from one shoulder where the seam had torn. Her pencil skirt was wrinkled. Her stockings ruined beyond repair. She had tried to wipe away the mascara streaks, but that had only made them worse, smudging them into dark crescents beneath eyes that couldn't quite meet his. Killian didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders in a single fluid motion. The fabric swallowed her, still warm from his body, smelling of sandalwood and something darker. Something that made her chest ache. "The car is outside," he said. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The walk through the precinct felt endless. Every officer they passed suddenly became very interested in their paperwork. Sloane could feel their stares anyway. Curious, judgmental, afraid. Afraid of the man walking beside her, whose hand hovered at the small of her back without quite touching, as if she were something fragile he was afraid to break, or something precious he was afraid to lose. The night air hit her like a slap when they stepped outside. A black town car idled at the curb, sleek and gleaming under the streetlights. A driver she didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, opened the rear door without a word. Sloane slid inside. The leather seats were soft, heated against the chill that had seeped into her bones. Killian followed, settling into the seat across from her rather than beside her, giving her space she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. The car pulled away from the curb. For 3 blocks, neither of them spoke. Sloane stared out the window at the blur of city lights, trying to compose the resignation letter in her head. 5 years of impeccable service, and she had thrown it all away for, what? A night out with friends that had ended with her ex-boyfriend's face meeting a barstool? The satisfaction of finally hitting back after months of his harassment? "His name," Killian said, cutting through the silence like a blade. Sloane's head snapped toward him. "What?" "The man who put you in that cell." Killian's expression hadn't changed. His voice remained perfectly level. But something in the air between them had shifted, something predatory, barely leashed. "I want his name." "Killian, it's not. I'm not asking as your employer, Sloane." The use of her first name hit her harder than it should have. In 5 years, he had never once called her anything but Ms. Mercer. The intimacy of it, the possession in it, made her breath catch. "Derek," she whispered. "Derek Vance. He's my ex. He showed up at the bar, wouldn't leave me alone, and when he grabbed me, I just—" She laughed, the sound hollow. "I just snapped. Broke a barstool over his head. In front of about 30 witnesses." Something flickered in Killian's eyes. It might have been approval. "He's been bothering you." It wasn't a question. "For months. Showing up at my apartment. Calling my phone. I thought I could handle it." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. "I thought I was handling it." Killian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You should have told me. You're my boss. I don't bring personal problems into the office." "I'm not just your boss." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sloane felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked away for 5 years, buried beneath professionalism and appropriate boundaries and the desperate need not to feel what she felt every time he walked into the room. "Then what are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Killian leaned forward. In the dim light of the passing street lamps, his eyes seemed to glow, pale and fierce and utterly fixed on her. "What do you want me to be?" The question cracked her open. Maybe it was the adrenaline crash. Maybe it was the alcohol still swimming in her bloodstream. Maybe it was simply the exhaustion of pretending day after day that she didn't dream about this man in ways that would make her blush in the boardroom. But Sloane found herself answering with a truth she had never intended to speak aloud. "Everything," she said. "I want you to be everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Killian's expression didn't change. He didn't reach for her and didn't close the distance between them. He simply looked at her with those winter-gray eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, Sloane saw something flicker behind the ice. Something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "Then we have a problem, Ms. Mercer," he said quietly. Because I've wanted to be everything to you since the day you walked into my office with a resume in one hand and a fire in your eyes that no one else seemed to see." He paused. "And I have made some very dangerous enemies who would destroy you simply to hurt me." Sloane's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I'm not afraid of your enemies." "You should be. I've worked for you for 5 years. I know exactly what you are, Killian. I've seen the files. I've taken the calls. I've scheduled the meetings that aren't really meetings." She pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, drawing strength from it. "I know, and I'm still here. Doesn't that tell you something?" For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached across the space between them and took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm but gentle, the touch of a man who could crush bone but chose instead to cradle. "It tells me," he said, "that you are either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish." "Maybe both," she admitted. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe both." The car turned onto a tree-lined street that Sloane didn't recognize. Estates rose behind iron gates, their windows dark in the pre-dawn hours. She knew, without being told, that this wasn't the route to her apartment. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe. I have work in the morning." "You have the week off." "I didn't request." "Sloane." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, silencing her protest. "For once in your life, stop scheduling and start resting. You've earned it." She wanted to argue. She wanted to maintain at least some semblance of control over a situation that had spiraled so far beyond her that she couldn't even see the edges anymore. But exhaustion was pulling at her like a tide, and his hand was warm, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt safe. "Okay," she whispered. Killian's grip on her hand tightened, just slightly. A promise. A warning. A beginning. The car pulled through a set of iron gates, and Sloane watched through heavy-lidded eyes as a mansion rose from the darkness like something out of a Gothic novel. Tomorrow she would have questions. Tomorrow she would panic. Tomorrow she would try to put the pieces of her carefully constructed world back together. But tonight, she let Killian Blackwood's jacket swallow her whole, and she let herself fall. Is a protective boss a green flag or a red flag? Comment air if you want Killian to protect her, or queen if you want Sloane to take over the empire. Sloane woke to the scent of flowers and the soft rustle of unfamiliar sheets. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed beneath her was too soft, cloud-like, swallowing her in Egyptian cotton that probably cost more than her rent. The ceiling above her was too high, painted a pristine white and edged with crown molding that spoke of old money and older secrets. And the light filtering through the curtains was all wrong. Golden and warm, not the harsh gray of her apartment's single east-facing window. Then the memories came flooding back. The bar stool, the cold metal of handcuffs, and Killian's voice on the other end of a payphone line, calm and commanding. "Don't speak to anyone." She sat up too fast, and the room spun. The bedroom was enormous, larger than her entire apartment, she was fairly certain. The furniture was dark wood, antique, and immaculately maintained. A fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but stacked with logs ready to be lit. French doors led to a balcony she could just glimpse through gossamer curtains, and beyond them, a sprawl of manicured gardens. But it was the nightstand that caught her attention. A crystal vase sat there, overflowing with peonies. Soft pink ones, the color of dawn and new beginnings. Her favorite flower, a detail she had mentioned exactly once, 3 years ago, during a passing conversation about centerpieces for a charity gala. Beside the vase was a note, written in handwriting she knew as well as her own, precise, angular, and utterly unapologetic. "When you're ready, we need to talk. K." Sloane stared at the note for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she looked down at herself and realized she was no longer wearing her ruined blouse and skirt. Someone had changed her into silk pajamas, cream-colored, expensive, and exactly her size. She chose not to think too hard about that. A door to the left revealed an ensuite bathroom that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel. Marble floors, a soaking tub deep enough to swim in, and a shower with so many jets she couldn't begin to guess their purpose. Sloane caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her makeup was gone, but dark circles had taken its place. Her hair hung limp around her shoulders. She looked exactly like a woman who had been arrested, bailed out by the mob, and emotionally eviscerated in the back of a town car. Because she was. She showered quickly, or as quickly as one could when the water pressure was that perfect, and found her own clothes hanging in the closet, cleaned and pressed and repaired so expertly that she couldn't find any trace of the damage. Her shoes sat beneath them, polished to a shine. It was, somehow, the most unsettling thing she had experienced since waking up. She dressed in her own armor. Fresh stockings, a straightened skirt, and a blouse buttoned to the collar. She twisted her hair into its usual sleek knot and applied the minimal makeup she found waiting in the bathroom drawer. By the time she stepped out of the bedroom, she looked like Sloane Mercer, executive assistant. Not Sloane Mercer, jailbird and confessed lovesick fool. The hallway outside was long and lined with oil paintings that probably belonged in museums. Sloane had no idea where to go, but she followed the scent of coffee until she reached a staircase that swept down into a foyer larger than most churches. Killian was waiting for her in a sunlit breakfast room. He sat at the head of a table that could seat 12, a newspaper spread before him, and a cup of coffee at his elbow. In the light of day, wearing a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, he looked almost normal. Like any other wealthy businessman, I enjoy a quiet morning. Except for the eyes. The eyes were still winter. "Good morning," he said, setting down the paper as she entered. "How did you sleep?" "Like the dead," she admitted. "What time is it?" "Just past noon." Sloane's stomach dropped. "Noon? I never sleep past 7. Why didn't you?" "Because you needed rest." He gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit. Eat. We'll talk after." She wanted to protest. She wanted to march over there and demand to know what the hell was happening, why she was in his house, what he had meant in the car when he said. Her stomach growled. Loudly. Killian's lips twitched. "Sit, Sloane." She sat. A staff member she hadn't noticed appeared from nowhere, setting a plate before her. Eggs Benedict, perfectly poached, with a side of fresh fruit and toast that smelled like heaven. Coffee materialized at her elbow, prepared exactly the way she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. "You know how I take my coffee," she said. "I know everything about you." The words should have been creepy. Coming from any other man they would have been. But Killian delivered them like a simple statement of fact, and when Sloane looked at his face, she saw no possessiveness, no malice, only the quiet certainty of a man who paid attention to the details that mattered. She ate in silence, hyper-aware of his presence. He returned to his newspaper, but she could feel him watching her from the corner of his eye, tracking every movement of her fork, every sip of her coffee. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt strangely domestic. When her plate was empty and a second cup of coffee was warming her hands, Killian finally set down the paper. "The man from the bar," he said. "Derek Vance." Sloane's grip tightened on her cup. "What about him?" "He won't be bothering you again." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sloane set down her coffee very carefully, her fingers suddenly cold despite its warmth. "Killian, what did you do?" "Nothing permanent." His expression remained neutral. "He received a visit this morning from some associates of mine. They explained in very clear terms that his presence in your life is no longer welcome. He's currently on a flight to the West Coast. He won't be returning. You can't just... She stopped, exhaling sharply. I was handling it. You were handling it by getting arrested. That's not handling it, Sloane. That's spiraling. He leaned forward, and for the first time, she saw something crack through his composure. Not anger, concern. You should have come to me. The moment he started harassing you, you should have walked into my office and told me. I didn't want to be a problem. You could never be a problem. The sincerity in his voice stole her breath. Sloane stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some elaborate game. She found nothing but that winter-gray gaze, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. Last night, she said quietly. In the car. The things I said. Did you mean them? She should lie. She should laugh it off, blame the alcohol, and retreat behind the wall of professionalism she had spent 5 years building. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But Sloane had spent her entire night in a jail cell, and somewhere between the cold metal bench and the warm leather of his car, she had lost her taste for safety. Yes, she said. I meant every word. Killian was silent for a long moment. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, moving with that predatory grace that made her pulse quicken. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that she could count the flecks of silver in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender, so unexpected, that her breath caught in her throat. Then we have a great deal to discuss, he murmured. But first, I need you to understand something, Sloane. The world I live in, the real one, not the boardrooms and charity galas, is not a kind place. Some people would hurt you simply because you matter to me. And you do matter to me. You have mattered to me for longer than I care to admit. I know what you are, she whispered. You know what I show the world. You don't know what I'm capable of. Then show me. His eyes searched her face. Are you certain? I've been certain for 5 years. I was just too afraid to admit it. Something shifted in his expression. Something raw and hungry and achingly human. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and Sloane saw not Killian Blackwood, the man the underworld feared, but simply Killian. A man who had been alone for far too long. Then stay, he said. Stay and let me show you everything. Sloane's hand rose almost of its own accord and pressed against his chest. Beneath her palm, his heart beat steady and strong, a reminder that beneath the ice there was warmth. I'm not going anywhere, she said. And for the first time since she'd dialed his number from that cold precinct phone, she meant it. The next 3 days existed in a strange limbo between dream and waking. Sloane stayed in the mansion. It wasn't a decision so much as an inevitability. Her apartment had been compromised, according to Killian's head of security, and until they could verify that Derek hadn't left any unwelcome surprises, it wasn't safe for her to return. She suspected this was an excuse. She also suspected she didn't care. They danced around each other like binary stars caught in each other's gravity. Breakfast together in the sunlit morning room. Long afternoons in his study, where she helped him sort through legitimate business papers while pretending not to notice the locked drawers she had never been authorized to open. Dinners by candlelight, the conversation flowing easier than it had any right to, spanning everything from philosophy to favorite films to the best way to organize a hostile takeover. But they didn't touch. Not since that moment in the breakfast room when his fingers had brushed her hair. It was as if they had both stepped to the edge of a precipice and were now standing there, paralyzed, afraid to jump. On the 4th day, Sloane decided she was done being afraid. She found him in the library, a cathedral of a room, 2 stories tall, with rolling ladders and first editions and a fireplace large enough to roast a pig. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the setting sun, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "We need to stop doing this," she said from the doorway. Killian turned. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured between them. "This careful, polite, terrified dance. You told me you wanted to show me everything. So show me. Stop treating me like I'm made of glass." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then he set down his whiskey with a soft click and crossed the room in 3 long strides. Sloane held her ground, even as her heart hammered against her ribs, even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat. He stopped inches away, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You want to know what you're asking?" His voice was low and rough-edged. "You're asking me to stop pretending that I haven't spent 5 years memorizing the way you move through a room. You're asking me to stop pretending that I don't know your coffee order, your favorite flower, and the way you chew your bottom lip when you're thinking. You're asking me to admit that I have watched you with an obsession that should terrify you. It doesn't. It should." His hand came up, hovering at her jaw without quite touching. "I am not a good man, Sloane. I have done things that would make you sick. I have ordered things that would make you run. And I have wanted you through all of it. Wanted you in ways that have nothing to do with contracts or professional boundaries." "Then stop wanting," she whispered, "and start having." The last thread of his control snapped. His mouth came down on hers with a desperation that stole her breath. 5 years of restraint unraveling in a single searing kiss. His hands fisted in her hair, angling her head back, deepening the kiss until she could taste the whiskey on his tongue, until her own hands were clawing at his shoulders just to stay upright. This was nothing like the tentative first kisses of her past. This was claiming. This was possession. 2 people had spent half a decade pretending they didn't burn for each other, finally letting the fire consume them. When they broke apart, gasping, Killian's forehead pressed against hers. "There's no going back from this," he said, his voice ragged. "If we do this, if we become this, you're in it. All of it. The blood. The darkness. The enemies who will come for you just because you're mine." "I know. And you still want this?" Sloane pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. In the fading light, they burned like molten silver. Desperate, hopeful, terrified. "I want you," she said. "All of you. Even the parts you think I can't handle." Something cracked in his expression. Something healed. "Then you have me," he said. "God help us both, but you have me." He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent, and Sloane felt the last of her walls crumble to dust. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know what shadows lurked in the corners of his world, waiting to swallow her whole. But standing there in the fading light, wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous man she had ever known, Sloane Mercer felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt at home. The education began the next morning. Sloane had known, in an abstract way, that Killian Blackwood was not a legitimate businessman. The late-night meetings that weren't on any official calendar. The visitors who never signed the guest log. The documents she had filed under names that didn't match any corporations she could find on public record. She had known. She had simply chosen not to look too closely. Now, Killian opened the locked drawers. "The Blackwood family has operated in this city for 4 generations," he said, spreading ledgers and documents across the desk in his private office, the one she had never been allowed to enter. "We began in bootlegging during Prohibition, expanded into gambling in the 50s, real estate development in the 70s. That's where most of our legitimate holdings come from now." Sloane stared at the pages before her. Numbers she recognized, structures she had helped build, But now she could see the shadow architecture beneath. The shell companies weren't just tax shelters. They were laundromats. "I've been managing a criminal empire," she said slowly. "For 5 years." "You've been managing the legitimate face of a criminal empire," Killian corrected. "The Blackwood Corporation is real. The charitable foundations are real. The property developments, the tech investments, the venture capital. All real, all legal, all profitable." He paused. "They also provide excellent cover for the less legal revenue streams." "Which are?" "Protection, gambling, import, export of certain restricted materials." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "We don't deal in human trafficking. We don't touch children. We don't sell to cartels. I have rules, Sloane. Principles." I know that sounds absurd coming from a man who just admitted to racketeering, but there it is. She should have been horrified. She should have been halfway to the door, calling the FBI, burning every bridge she had ever built in this gilded cage. Instead, she found herself looking at the ledgers with new eyes. "These numbers don't add up," she said. Killian's brow furrowed. "What?" "Here." She pointed to a column she had reorganized 3 years ago, back when she thought it was just a poorly managed subsidiary. "The import fees. They're too high for the volume you're moving. And here, these shell companies are crossing revenue streams in a way that would throw red flags in any serious audit." She looked up. "Your CFO is either incompetent or stealing from you." A slow smile spread across Killian's face. Not the cold, calculated smile he showed the world, but something warmer. Something almost proud. "My CFO retired 6 months ago," he said. "I've been looking for a replacement." Sloane's eyes narrowed. "Is this a job offer?" "It's an observation. You've been running my legitimate empire for 5 years without knowing it. Imagine what you could do if you knew everything." The weight of what he was offering settled over her like a cloak. Not just his heart. Not just his bed. But his empire. His trust. The keys to a kingdom built on blood and shadow. "The other families," she said slowly. "They'll never accept me. I'm not. I don't have the background. You have something better. You have my protection." His hand covered hers on the desk. "And more importantly, you have a mind they won't see coming. In this world, Sloane, everyone expects the guns. No one expects the accountant." She laughed despite herself. "Is that supposed to be romantic?" "It's supposed to be true." Sloane looked down at the ledgers, at the tangled web of numbers and names and secrets. A week ago, she had been a perfectly professional secretary with a perfectly boring life and a perfectly hidden heart. Now she was sitting in the inner sanctum of a criminal empire, being offered a crown she had never asked for. "If I do this," she said, "I do it my way. No more secrets. No more locked drawers. If I'm going to help you build this, I need to see all of it. Done. And I'm not just your girlfriend, or your lover, or whatever we're calling this." She met his eyes squarely. "If I'm in, I'm a partner. Equal. No more protecting me from the truth because you think I can't handle it." Something flickered in his gaze. Pain, perhaps. Or fear. "There are people who will kill you for that title. Then they can try." For a long moment, Killian simply stared at her. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Soft, reverent, and certain. "Equal," he agreed. "Partners. In everything." Sloane smiled and felt the last piece of her old life fall away. There was no going back now. There was only forward, into the fire, into the dark, and into the arms of the man who had just handed her the keys to his kingdom. Think the Lombardis are finished? Wait until you see who was really behind the bar fight in Chapter 1. Follow for the next update. For 3 weeks, Sloane lived in a world she had never imagined. She spent her mornings untangling the Blackwood Empire's finances, finding inefficiencies and leaks that had cost them millions over the years. Her afternoons were devoted to meetings with Killian's inner circle, hardened men and women who had eyed her with suspicion at first, then grudging respect as she caught errors they had missed and proposed solutions they hadn't considered. And her nights belonged to Killian. He was insatiable, not just for her body, but for her mind, her thoughts, and her dreams. They would lie tangled together in his massive bed, talking for hours about everything and nothing, and Sloane would marvel at how easily the walls between them had crumbled. The man the world feared had a dry wit and a secret love of terrible action movies and a habit of tracing patterns on her skin while he thought. She was falling in love with him. Or maybe she had always been in love with him and was only now allowing herself to feel it. But shadows lurked at the edges of paradise. The Lombardi family had controlled the city's southern territories for decades. Old money, old blood, old grudges. When word spread that Killian Blackwood had taken a lover, not just any lover, but a woman from outside the life, they saw weakness. Sloane first learned of their interest on a quiet Tuesday evening. She and Killian were dining at a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood that felt worlds away from his glittering empire. No security visible, no fanfare, just pasta and wine and his hand holding hers across the white tablecloth. It felt almost normal, almost safe. The first bullet shattered the window 3 feet from her head. Time fractured. One moment she was laughing at something Killian said. The next, she was on the floor, his body covering hers as the world exploded into chaos. Glass rained down like deadly snow. Gunfire crackled, sharp and percussive. Somewhere, a woman screamed. Then, silence. Sloane. Killian's voice was in her ear, urgent. Are you hurt? She took inventory. Scratches on her arms from the glass. A ringing in her ears. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. But no bullet wounds. No gushing blood. I'm okay, she managed. I'm okay. He pulled her to her feet and swept her toward the kitchen, where a back exit waited. His men appeared from nowhere. They had been there all along, she realized, invisible in the shadows, and formed a protective barrier around them as they fled into the night. The car ride back to the mansion was silent. Sloane's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She pressed them between her knees, willing them to still, but they trembled like leaves in a storm. Killian sat beside her, rigid as steel, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. When they reached the mansion, he exploded. I should never have taken you there. He was pacing the length of his study, his composure shattered. I should have kept you here behind the walls where they couldn't. Killian. This is my fault. I got complacent. I thought I could have one normal evening with you, and now they know. They know you exist, they know you matter, and they will use you to destroy me. Killian. I'm putting you in the safe house in the Catskills. Tonight. You'll stay there until I've dealt with the Lombardis. Killian. He stopped, chest heaving. Sloane rose from the chair where she had been sitting, her legs steadier now, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. I am not going to a safe house. This isn't a negotiation. You're right. It's not. She crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the wild hammer of his heart beneath her palms. We agreed. Partners. Equals. That means you don't get to make decisions about my safety without me. Your safety is not negotiable. Neither is my agency. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But locking me away like a princess in a tower isn't going to solve this. It's just going to make me a target they can reach the moment your back is turned. So what do you suggest? His voice was ragged. Let you walk around with a bullseye on your back? I suggest you let me fight back. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Killian's expression shifted, anger giving way to something more complex, more uncertain. You're not a soldier, Sloane. No. I'm an accountant. A grim smile touched her lips. And I've spent the last 3 weeks learning exactly how the Lombardis launder their money. If you want to destroy them, Killian, you don't need more guns. You need someone who can follow the money. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, the tension bled from his shoulders. You're serious. I've never been more serious in my life. He exhaled a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry all his fear with it. Then his hands came up to cup her face, tilting it toward his. You terrify me, he murmured. You know that. I have faced down killers and kingpins and men who would murder their own mothers for power, and none of them have ever terrified me the way you do. Good, she said. Then you know I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her, fierce and desperate, and Sloane tasted salt on his lips. Tears, she realized. Killian Blackwood, the man the underworld feared, was crying. For her. Partner, he whispered against her mouth. Equal. In everything. In everything, she agreed. And in the quiet of his study, with broken glass still glittering in her hair and blood still drying on her skin, Sloane Mercer began to plan a war. Despite her impassioned speech, Killian's fear won the first battle. Sloane woke the next morning to find the mansion transformed into a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the grounds. Security cameras monitored every entrance. Her phone had been replaced with a secure device that could only contact a handful of pre-approved numbers, and the front gates were locked from the outside. It's temporary, Killian assured her over breakfast. Breakfast that was now served in the interior dining room, away from any windows. Just until we know the extent of the threat. And how long will that take? He didn't answer. The first day, Sloane told herself it was necessary. The second day, she reorganized his files to distract herself. By the third day, she was climbing the walls. She found herself standing at the window of her bedroom, staring out at the manicured gardens she could no longer walk through. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had escaped one cage, the golden handcuffs of her perfectly professional life, only to find herself in another. This one just had better sheets. On the fourth day, she started digging. The files Killian had given her access to were extensive, but they weren't complete. There were gaps, transactions that didn't quite add up, names that appeared once and then vanished. She had noticed them before but hadn't had time to investigate. Now, locked in her gilded cage with nothing but time, she began to pull at the threads. The Lombardi family's finances were a tangled web of legitimate businesses and shadow operations. Restaurants that laundered drug money. Construction companies that employed ghost workers to move cash. A shipping operation that brought more than olive oil through the ports. But there was something else, something bigger. A pattern emerged from the chaos. Small payments, irregular but consistent, flowed from Lombardi accounts to an offshore entity she couldn't trace. The amounts were insignificant on their own, easily overlooked. But added together over 5 years, they totaled millions. Someone was skimming from the Lombardis. And whoever it was had been doing it for a very long time. Sloane dug deeper. She cross-referenced dates, tracked shell companies through a maze of international registrations, and slowly, piece by piece, assembled a picture that made her blood run cold. The offshore entity wasn't just stealing from the Lombardis. It was connected to a name she recognized, a name that had appeared in Killian's files, too. A lieutenant in the Lombardi organization who had always seemed too ambitious, too hungry, and too eager to rise. Dominic Russo. The mediator. The neutral party. The man whose family had arbitrated disputes between the 5 families for 3 generations. He was playing both sides, building a war chest, waiting for the right moment to strike. And suddenly, the attack on the restaurant made terrible sense. Sloane sat back, her mind racing. The Lombardis hadn't ordered the hit. Or if they had, they'd been manipulated into it by a man who wanted both families weakened. A man who stood to gain everything if Killian and the Lombardis destroyed each other. She needed to tell Killian. But as she reached for her secure device, a thought stopped her. Killian would want to protect her. He would lock her away tighter and refuse to let her anywhere near the danger. He would handle it the way he always handled things, with guns and men and violence. But violence was exactly what Russo wanted. More blood, more chaos, and more distraction while he consolidated power in the shadows. There had to be another way. Sloane looked at the documents spread before her. The paper trail, the financial records, and the damning evidence of Russo's betrayal. In her hands, she held the ammunition for a different kind of war. Not bullets, but balance sheets. Not guns, but leverage. The 5 families were meeting in 2 weeks. A summit, held on neutral ground, to discuss the territorial disputes that had been brewing for months. Russo would be there as a mediator. The Lombardis would be there, seeking to legitimize their aggression. And Killian would be there, trying to protect what was his. But what if she was there too? Not as Killian's hidden liability. Not as the woman who needed protecting. As his CFO. His partner. His secret weapon. A slow smile spread across Sloane's face. The gilded cage had given her exactly what she needed. Time to plan, resources to research, and the motivation to stop being a damsel. It was time to become a queen. Killian found her in his study that evening, surrounded by documents. "You should be resting," he said from the doorway. "I should be a lot of things." Sloane didn't look up from the spreadsheet before her. "Come look at this." He crossed to her side, his brow furrowing as he took in the organized chaos she had created. Flowcharts connected names to companies to transactions. Highlighted figures traced paths through shell corporations. At the center of it all was a single name, circled in red. Dominic Russo. "What is this?" Killian asked quietly. "This is why the Lombardis tried to kill us." Sloane finally looked up, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. Except they didn't. Not really. They were manipulated into it, by the man who's supposed to be keeping the peace. She walked him through it. The offshore accounts, the skimming, and the paper trail that connected Russo to both families' most destructive decisions over the past 5 years. By the time she finished, Killian's expression had gone cold in a way that made her shiver. "He's been playing us all," Killian said. "Stoking the fires, profiting from the chaos. And the summit in 2 weeks is his endgame. He's going to push for a war, a real one this time, and when the dust settles, he'll be the only one left standing." "Then we don't go to the summit." "No." Sloane shook her head. "We go. But we don't play his game." She pulled a folder from the stack before her, a thick file filled with evidence, records, and proof. "We expose him. In front of everyone. On neutral ground, where the other families can see exactly what he's been doing. If we accuse him without proof, we look paranoid. We don't accuse. We present." She tapped the folder. "I've built a case that would hold up in federal court. Tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy. The families might not care about the law, but they'll care about being stolen from. Every Don in that room will want his head." Killian stared at the folder, then at her. "You want to walk into a room full of killers and call one of them a traitor." "I want to walk into a room full of killers and save your life. There's a difference." "Sloane." I know it's dangerous. I know there's a chance it goes wrong. But the alternative is war, a war Russo designed, a war he'll win. She stood, crossing to him, placing her hands on his chest. You told me I was your partner. Prove it. Let me fight beside you. His hands covered hers. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. This woman who had walked into his office 5 years ago with a resume and a fire in her eyes, who had weathered jailhouses and gunfire and the weight of his world without flinching. Not as a guest, he said finally. As my CFO. Sloane's heart leaped. You're agreeing? I'm acknowledging what you've already proven. You're the smartest person in any room you walk into, Sloane. Including the ones full of killers. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. But if anything happens to you, it won't. I'll have you. He kissed her then. Deep and fierce and full of everything he couldn't say. When they broke apart, his forehead pressed against hers, his breath warm on her lips. Partners, he murmured. In everything. 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks to prepare for the most dangerous gamble of their lives. A high-stakes confrontation where the wrong word could mean death and the right one could reshape the underworld's balance of power forever. Sloane smiled. She had never been more ready. The summit was held in an old mansion on the outskirts of the city, neutral territory that had hosted negotiations for over a century. It stood like a ghost of old money, all ivy-covered walls and iron gates, surrounded by grounds that could hide an army. Sloane had never been more terrified in her life. She hid it well, of course. The armor she wore was literal as well as metaphorical. A sleek black dress designed to conceal the Kevlar vest beneath and heels low enough to run in if necessary. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot. Her makeup was flawless, and her expression was carved from ice. At her side, Killian moved like a predator entering contested territory. His men flanked them, a display of strength, but not aggression. They were here to talk after all. To talk and to destroy. The great hall had been prepared for the summit, a long table surrounded by representatives from the 5 families, their advisors arrayed behind them like living shields. Sloane recognized the faces from her research, the Lombardis cold-eyed and furious, the Chens calculating, the O'Malleys skeptical, and the Valentinis bored. And at the head of the table, presiding over them all with an air of benevolent authority, Dominic Russo. He was smaller than she expected. Distinguished, gray at the temples, with the kindly face of someone's grandfather. But his eyes tracked her entrance with a sharpness that belied the friendly smile. Killian, Russo said warmly, rising. So glad you could join us. And this must be the secretary I've heard so much about. CFO, actually, Sloane said, her voice steady. But I understand how easy it is to overlook the people who handle the money. Something flickered in Russo's gaze. A crack in the benevolent mask. The summit began with the usual posturing. Territorial grievances, perceived slights, and demands for compensation. The Lombardis pushed hard, citing the unprovoked aggression of recent months, never mind that they had started it. Killian countered with evidence of their escalations. Back and forth, the ancient dance of men with too much power and not enough trust. Sloane waited. When the arguments had circled 3 times without resolution, when tempers were fraying and hands were drifting toward hidden weapons, she stood. The room fell silent. A woman speaking at a summit. It was unprecedented. Unthinkable. Perfect. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying through the sudden stillness. We've been discussing symptoms for an hour. Perhaps it's time we addressed the disease. She nodded to Killian, who placed the folder on the table. It landed with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. For the past 5 years, someone has been stealing from all of you. Small amounts, insignificant on their own. But together. She opened the folder, spreading documents across the table. $37 million. Siphoned through offshore accounts, hidden in legitimate transactions, funneled into a private war chest. Eyes turned to the papers, then to each other, then slowly to Russo. "This is absurd," Russo said, but his voice had lost its warmth. "You're accusing me." "I'm not accusing anyone." Sloane met his gaze squarely. "The documents speak for themselves. Bank records, shell company registrations, transaction logs that trace directly to accounts under your control." She turned to the room. "Mr. Russo has been playing us all. Stoking conflicts, extending negotiations, profiting from the chaos. This summit, it's designed to start a war, one that weakens everyone but him." Chaos erupted. Accusations flew. Hands reached for weapons before cooler heads intervened. Through it all, Sloane stood perfectly still, her heart pounding but her face serene, as 5 decades of Russo's carefully constructed reputation crumbled around him. In the end, it wasn't guns that destroyed him. It was a vote. The families agreed unanimously that Russo had betrayed the accords. His assets were frozen. His territories were seized. His own men escorted him from the room in a silence that said everything about his future. As for the Lombardis, faced with evidence that they had been manipulated into their aggression, they agreed to a ceasefire. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was enough. When the doors closed behind the last departing family, Killian turned to Sloane. "You just dismantled a 50-year empire with a spreadsheet," he said. "Spreadsheets are underrated." He laughed, a real laugh, full of wonder and disbelief, and pulled her into his arms. Around them, his men were smiling for the first time in months. "You magnificent woman," he murmured against her hair. "What would I do without you?" Sloane smiled into his chest. "Let's never find out." The wedding was the event of the decade. Not that the world would ever know. It was held in the mansion's great hall, transformed for the occasion into a cathedral of white roses and candlelight. 300 guests attended, representing every family that had once viewed the union as impossible. A Mafia boss and his secretary, bound not by blood or tradition, but by something far more dangerous: love. Sloane walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her veil trailing behind her like a promise. She carried peonies, pink ones her favorite, and her fingers trembled only slightly as she approached the altar where Killian waited. He was wearing a black suit, impeccably tailored, but it was his expression that stole her breath. For a man who had mastered the art of the mask, he wore his heart openly in this moment, vulnerable, awed, utterly hers. The ceremony was brief. Neither of them needed elaborate vows. They had already said everything that mattered in jail cells and car rides and boardrooms full of killers. When the officiant pronounced them married, when Killian lifted her veil and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his reputation, the great hall erupted in applause. Sloane Mercer, no, Sloane Blackwood now, smiled against her husband's lips. "Regrets?" he murmured. "Not a single one." The reception was a blur of toasts and dances and dignitaries paying their respects. The Lombardis sent a representative with a gift of rare vintage wine and a barely concealed grimace. The other families sent their regards and their eyes, watching for weakness, finding none. When the last guest had departed and the candles had burned low, Killian led Sloane to the balcony overlooking the gardens. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. "I should tell you something," he said, pulling her close. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "The night you called me from that jail cell, do you know what I was thinking? That your perfectly professional assistant had finally lost her mind?" He laughed softly. "I was thinking that someone had finally given me an excuse to stop pretending." His arms tightened around her. "I had wanted you for so long, Sloane. But I wouldn't. make the first move. You deserved better than this life. Better than me. And now I understand what you've been trying to teach me all along." He tilted her chin up, meeting her eyes. "It was never about deserving. It was about choosing. And you chose me. Every single time, even when it would have been easier to run." "I told you," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "No." He smiled, a real smile, the one he saved only for her. "You're going everywhere. With me. As my partner, my equal, my queen." I was going to say, beloved lunatic who takes on crime families with spreadsheets. But queen works too. She laughed, bright and free, and he caught the sound with a kiss. Below them, the gardens lay quiet and peaceful. Beyond the iron gates, the city hummed with life and danger and 1,000 stories yet to be told. And somewhere in the shadows, enemies were surely plotting, rivals were scheming, and the underworld was adjusting to its new reality. But for now, for this perfect crystalline moment, there was only this: two people who had found each other across the gulf of duty and fear, standing together against the dark. Sloane Blackwood, former secretary, current CFO, beloved wife, and undisputed queen of the Blackwood Empire, looked up at the stars and smiled. It had all started with a 3 a.m. phone call. And it would never end. Obsessed with the Blackwood Empire? Read the full uncut version of At 3 a.m., now at the link in bio. The end.